In 2009, a woman named Annie Sally, who lived in a nursing home in South Carolina called HCR Manor Care, died from excessive brain bleeding, essentially. Now, the month before, she had hit her head on a light in the bathroom of the nursing home. And according to a lawsuit filed by her family, she did not receive proper care in the aftermath of her accident, despite exhibiting signs that she needed serious care. So Annie Sally's family sued HCR Manor Care. But they also sued Carlyle, which is a massive private equity fund that at the time owned HCR Manor Care nursing homes, the second largest nursing home chain in the country. But the judge very quickly dismissed the lawsuit against Carlyle specifically. Carlyle had argued that it had nothing to do with Annie Sally's death, because what really did they, a bunch of finance guys living in New York, have to do with a specific South Carolinian branch of this nursing home chain?
#gross.
If a staff member in South Carolina was negligent, clearly that wasn't the fault of some private equity guys in New York, right? And the judge agreed with them, which, if you look at this from far enough away, seems fine. But it gets complicated. This is a story about big private equity companies and our healthcare system, the playbook they run, and the incentives that they are responding to. Because Carlyle and its finance guys in New York have everything to do with the death of Annie Sally. And these companies are making a fucking killing grandma. Welcome back to the Carly P. Riley Show. I'm Carly Riley. A little background for y'all. Private equity companies were built on something called the leveraged buyout. This means that private equity companies borrow a ton of money, they take on debt in order to buy a company, like say a nursing home chain, for example, or a hospital system. But instead of keeping the debt on their own books, they put the debt onto the company that they are buying. So when Carlyle buys a nursing home chain called HCR Manor Care by borrowing, hypothetically speaking, $4.8 billion, that $4.8 billion sits on the books of HCR Manor Care, not on the books of Carlyle. And HCR Manor Care, not Carlyle, has to pay interest on that debt. Carlyle, the $426 billion private equity firm, doesn't have to fucking touch that debt, which is very convenient if you're them. Now, this debt can be onerous for the companies themselves, the one that actually have to pay the interest on it. But it also might just be the beginning of their problems. Private equity firms like to buy companies that have assets and steady cash flows, because the company needs the assets and the steady cash flows, frankly, in order to pay down all the debt they've just been loaded up with. But cash flows and assets can also be used to pay fees to the private equity companies, which is also why private equity companies like businesses with cash flows and assets. For example, in addition to loading it up with $4.8 billion in debt, when Carlyle bought HCR Manor Care, they charged it a $61 million transaction fee. Carlyle took HCR Manor Care's credit card, because they just bought it, and then swiped it for themselves to pay themselves a $61 million transaction fee, and then an additional $27 million in management fees. Essentially, they took HCR Manor Care's credit card and rung up nearly $100 million for themselves, because why not? Because they could. This will be a theme today. Carlyle also ended up selling all of HCR Manor Care's real estate, literally the buildings it owned, which housed its residents. And this sale brought in billions of dollars, which were used in large part to make payouts to Carlyle and its investors. But it forced HCR Manor Care, the company, to rent property that it previously owned, which meant making $40 million a month in rent payments it previously didn't have to make. So if you're tracking this now, they were loaded up with $4.8 billion in debt. It then lost all of its real estate and started having to make $40 million in payments a month in rent payments. And then they had another $100 million that they had to pay towards their new owners, frankly, for the privilege of being owned by these new owners. Now, HCR Manor Care was a profitable business when Carlyle bought it. But 11 years later, the founders were rich off of having sold it to Carlyle. Carlyle's investors got their money back. But HCR Manor Care, the nursing home chain, was bankrupt. And to Annie Sally's family, these decisions had inevitable consequences at HCR Manor Care itself, namely staff shortages, a decline in the quality of care, and ultimately accidents and deaths. And one study found that 20,000 premature deaths can be attributed to private equity involvement in nursing homes. But private equity firms are a little sensy about this when you bring it up. I have friends in private equity who will tell me that these are cherry-picked examples. These are bad deals gone wrong. And look, I'm sensitive to the fact that not all of private equity is the same thing. It's not a monolith. And there are legitimate purposes for private equity companies in the business world. And frankly, private equity companies often deal with distressed companies that are struggling anyway. They can offer an infusion of cash to those struggling companies. I mean, private equity can do some good. There are businesses that end up better because of private equity involvement. But I am saying that private equity in healthcare has been pretty disastrous. And that's not because of any one example. It's because, frankly, of the incentives in the system. To put it simply, the incentives when it comes to private equity and healthcare are fucked. And you know what they say, show me the incentives and I'll show you a bunch of dead grandmas and people with maggots in their scrotum. That is literally something else that happened at an HCR Manor Care nursing home. Private equity companies love the healthcare industry. In 2021 alone, they invested nearly $150 billion into healthcare companies in just 1 year. And what makes the healthcare industry so appealing is that private equity firms can do pretty much whatever they want. They can raise prices to us, they can lower the quality of care, and we really can't do a thing about it because it's healthcare. It's not a hamburger. If you go to a hamburger joint and you have a bad experience or the prices are $20 higher than they are everywhere else, you won't go back to that hamburger joint. You'll go to another place, a spot down the street, or hell, you'll make one at home because it's a hamburger. But you can't do that in healthcare. If you are having a heart attack, you can't price shop around and be like, what's the best ambulance to use today? What's the best hospital to go to? No, you just take whatever is in front of you because you're having a heart attack.
This man has no insurance.
And in this way, there are a number of aspects of our healthcare industry that actually effectively operate as monopolies. A hospital, an emergency room, an ambulance service, those are things that tend to have monopolies in their specific local area. And private equity firms can buy up the hospitals and emergency rooms and ambulance services and take advantage of that monopoly because why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? I mean, in theory, their conscience would come in, but come on, they live in New York. What do a couple of finance guys in New York have to feel bad about when it comes to a poorly run hospital in Texas? They have nothing to do with that. Now, private equity firms haven't created the monopolies when it comes to a hospital or an emergency room in a local area. But other times they do actually create monopolies themselves. The private equity firms don't call these things monopolies for perhaps obvious regulatory reasons. They call them roll-ups. And this is where a private equity firm buys up many of the same kinds of clinics, like a dermatology clinic or an ophthalmology clinic or that kind of thing, within a particular geographic region. So for example, in Texas, there is one anesthesiology group, the USAP, which is a national group, but it operates primarily in Texas. And 60% of all anesthesiology revenue generated in hospitals in the entire state of Texas goes to USAP. Texas is a big state. It is like 10 European countries, and more than half of the revenue generated from anesthesiology treatments in hospitals goes to one company that is, of course, private equity owned. And this entire monopoly of USAP was a strategy designed by a private equity firm. It didn't have this kind of monopoly until a private equity firm got involved and architected this entire strategy. Now, there are arguments for these kinds of roll-ups, and it's that in theory, it could cut costs because it leverages synergies. Take a shot every time I use a corporate buzzword. Leverages synergies, which will give the clinics more leverage and negotiating power against the insurance companies, which again could drive costs down. But of course, spoiler alert, it doesn't tend to cut costs for the patients. The clinics and the private equity firms themselves tend to pocket the savings because again, why wouldn't they? What the hell are we going to do about it? Now, the other argument for roll-ups is that it helps take the administrative work off of doctors' plates, which again is great in theory. You want doctors focused on medical care and not on admin. But that's until you realize that there's actually a very fine line between what constitutes administrative work and what constitutes medical work. For example, deciding how many staff should work in a hospital on a given shift. Is that an administrative decision or a medical one? The system has decided it's an administrative decision, and frankly, that means it's a financial decision. But the result of that is that hospitals are chronically understaffed. Listen to these nurses interviewed by the New York Times talk about their experience in the hospital system.
I could no longer work in critical care under the conditions I was being forced to work under with poor staffing, and that's when I left.
If you push me past my limit, past my capacity of being able to multitask, something's gonna get missed. And when I say something, I'm talking about your mother, I'm talking about your father, I'm talking about your husband and your wife.
There have been many instances where patients that die that shouldn't have died. I know that unequivocally.
You have nurses sitting in front of a camera saying publicly, patients are dying because we are so understaffed. And there have been lawsuits about this. There have been a number of them because you've had instances where hospital staffing firms and hospitals have admitted, even in writing, that staffing decisions are being made on financial considerations, not based on the needs of patients. And it's even worse than that. It's not just a financial consideration like, oh, we literally don't have the money for more staff. No, it's like, we care about the share price, the stock price. Like, those are driving patient-centric decisions in these for-profit hospitals. But magically, these lawsuits rarely, if ever, seem to reach the private equity firms themselves. So even if a clinic can be held accountable, even if USAP can be held accountable for having a monopoly, that's something that's in the court system right now, there's no real accountability for the private equity firms that own these companies. Because remember, as has been determined by the court system, what do a bunch of finance guys in New York have to do with the outcomes of financial problems they have literally created because of the way their model works? Apparently nothing. Judges have decided nothing. Now look, I'm picking on private equity here, obviously, but this isn't actually all a private equity specific problem per se. I mean, this is a problem with for-profit hospitals writ large, you could certainly argue. But here's a very interesting fact. 30% of proprietary for-profit hospitals are owned by private equity firms. So when we're talking about a problem with hospital systems and greed, let's call it, within a hospital system, or bad incentives within hospital systems, you're talking about private equity because they are by far the single most dominant player in this market. And again, I've said it before, but private equity firms are not a monolith. So you have different operating models for different private equity firms, but generally speaking, they operate under the same specific conditions that exacerbate the inherently bad incentives in the system, which is they load companies up with debt, which can obviously put companies in a very financially precarious situation. And also private equity firms are often investing for a relatively short time horizon, which means they have pressure to make a return within, even 10 years, which is relatively short. And so they're willing to resort to things like selling off real estate or transaction fees that are kind of bullshit in order to make their money back because they know they'll be out of there in a few years, even if it's a bad decision for the company itself. And by the way, this is their job. Like, this is the job of private equity. They have a fiduciary duty to do right by their investors. The problem is that their fiduciary duty is really fucking shit up for the rest of us. What I find so puzzling is when, again, friends of mine in private equity will say, well, no, these are cherry-picked examples. I'm going, no, I get it. Your job is to make as much money as possible on this investment. That is obviously going to lead to situations in which we, as consumers and people who need healthcare treatment, are fucked. When HCR ManorCare filed for bankruptcy in 2017, they blamed changes to the way Medicare payouts were made for the reason that the company went under, the reason that HCR ManorCare went bankrupt. And I thought this was really interesting because you had a lot of people, well, to the extent that there were a lot of people even paying attention to this, and there really weren't, but to the people who were paying attention to this, a lot of folks' reaction was, that's stupid. It's not Medicare's fault, right? The problem was all the financial engineering and the bullshit that Carlyle did and the financial shenanigans that they did to HCR ManorCare. That's the reason that HCR ManorCare went out of business. But what I think is much more interesting to consider is like, what if it is true, or at least partially true? What if changes to the way Medicare made payouts is actually the thing that brought down HCR ManorCare? Well, what does that mean? It would mean that patients literally dying, quality of care plummeting. I mean, some of the stories you hear out of these facilities are really very harrowing. You had someone who, again, found maggots in their scrotum. All of that couldn't kill HCR ManorCare. In what other industry could a product get that bad and we would still pay for it? If I saw a maggot near a hamburger, I wouldn't go back to that hamburger place ever. I would never go back to that restaurant. But we're finding them in people's bodies and we all live with it because mom and dad have to live somewhere when they're too old to live by themselves. And that's sort of my entire point. Like, that's how I know I'm not just cherry picking examples, even if HCR ManorCare is a particularly bad one. Because if you have a business that can continue to make money, even after things have gotten that bad, and if the owners will never be held legally liable for the fact that things have gotten that bad, well, then obviously they're going to keep doing it because why the hell not? Why wouldn't they? So I think my private equity friends have it wrong. As far as I'm concerned, the incentives are bad. And the onus should be on them to explain to me why these tragedies aren't just obviously the inevitable outcomes of bad incentives. Frankly, I look at the system and I think it is a miracle that things aren't worse. Like, doctors and nurses are doing so much to keep this whole thing afloat. But in any case, that is our episode for today. I hope you did enjoy. If you did, please consider subscribing, commenting, liking, all of the things. And with that, I will see you next time.